So yeah, my name's Dr. Johnny Guckian. I'm a CMT 2 in Leeds, soon to be dermatology reg. But I wear a few other hats, as has been mentioned. These include being Director of Social Media and Communications at ASME. So I've been doing a lot of the tweeting from ASME today. I'm also founder of Medics, as before. If you've not been on Medics, we love puns and memes and things like that. So if you're into that and into MedEd, then absolutely go for it. I'm also editorial trainee at the British Journal of Dermatology. But what I'm here today to do is to act as a bit of a devil's advocate, as somewhat as a counterpoint to Dr. Raj, the TikTok doctor who was on earlier. So I'm aiming for this to be a bit of a light-hearted presentation, which you can take some sort of practical but also theoretical lessons from. So instead, I'm here to tell you a few stories. So next slide, please. So we are all here because a lot of bad stuff has happened. As a result of all this badness, we've spent the last 3 months making Zoom one of the most powerful companies on the planet. The entirety of medical education has been thrown into disarray, into chaos, as many of our amazing presenters have described today. Next slide, please. And really, this was put quite profoundly by one of my colleagues on the ASME board, who's a professor of medical education. He just said that COVID-19 is the most disruptive event in the last 100 years of MedEd. And that's quite a powerful thought. Next slide. So we're setting the scene here. And I'm actually going to take some slight blame for this disruption because I've clearly jinxed it by coming up with the theme for this year's ASME conference, which has been since postponed because of COVID. We called it Disrupting Medical Education. So really the lesson there, kids, is be careful what you wish for. Next slide, please. So MedEd never really stays still. I saw this discussion earlier in the week. Throughout lockdown, there's been a proliferation of technology-enhanced learning resources, which have moved to fill this learning vacuum. So these predominantly act in the mysterious and murky realm of social media. And many actually, without scrutiny or a lot of discussion around evidence, have taken off. And some of them are absolutely fantastic, and we've heard from a lot of them today. Now, I'd be a hypocrite to criticize this because we've gotten in the act, though I should say that in this case, this wasn't me retweeting myself, though that has been known to happen. Next slide, please. So the question we have to ask is social media the answer? Well, I liken social media a bit to a birthday party of an extended family member. So there's a lot of chat, lots of people asking you questions, but you never really feel quite comfortable. There's an elderly guy in the corner being really super on PC, and you know that at any given moment, your mum could appear from nowhere and just embarrass you. But like any family, there's a lot to learn from them. So the question is social media the knight in shining armor in this story, riding forth to save medical education? So my talk will examine this claim and suggest that perhaps things aren't quite as straightforward as they seem. So understand I've got a poll now. I'm going to get you to choose a side. Now remember, there is no right answer to this, other than perhaps a Star Wars GIF on Twitter, which I heavily encourage. So I'll let you make your choice, make it wisely. My challenge is perhaps to convince you otherwise. I'll give you a second. So what I'll do is I'll crack on. So what I want you to, oh, there you go. Oh, good, right, excellent, good, right. I like a challenge, right. So what I want you to bear in mind throughout this talk is that as I play devil's advocate, medical education is a science, all right? And that's what we do at ASME. We're the Association for the Study of Medical Education. It's about research. So if we want to improve what we do in medical education, we need to engage with this research. So therefore, yes, I will talk about my experience. However, I'm going to critique that in the context of the evidence that's out there and try to disrupt some previously accepted claims, things you might accept as norms. And as well, using that, we're going to make some changes for some suggestions for innovation. And all the while, I want you to do the same. I want you to reflect on your own social media experience. I want you to think critically, and I want you to consider what you could do better. Next slide, please. So reflect, critique, and innovate. That's our message of this talk. Next slide. So when we talk about this story, it's going to be a story of good practice heroes and dangerous social media villains, and what educational theory is going to guide us through it. Next slide, please. And to help us highlight that is Oscar, my Bichon Friche. Here he is wearing socks. Oscar will pop up as a theory warning to let you know there's going to be some heavy stuff about to happen. This is a bit inspired by my mentor, Professor John Spencer at Newcastle, who used to bring his dog into the lectures. So if we're all set, let's begin. Next slide, please. So in this story, we'll take you back 5 years to 2015 to when I set up MediSense. It's my MedEd website. So this featured loads of social media learning at the start. I'll touch on that later. So one fine day, I got this notification on Reddit, and I'll read it to you because it strikes me deep to the heart. So finally, frankly, I think this type of tool is a disservice to medical education. There are specific lessons to be learned, and they shouldn't involve 6-second video clips. No one wants a doctor who was trained in this way. In 10 years, you will understand this. Source, I'm an oncologist. So this made me quite upset, and I wrote a reply. Next slide, please. So my reply, it was quite lengthy, but I broke it down into 4 statements because I've been told I'm not allowed to swear in this. So I've only taken the 4 statements. There's a lot of evidence for social media. There is this is where all the students are. This is an opportunity for good quality learning, and I can connect to experts all over the world. So we've heard loads of these arguments already today, and they are compelling, interesting arguments. So in this tale, what we're going to do is we're going to consider the validity of each of these arguments, and I'm going to try to turn them upside down. I'm going to get you to think and question these. So let's start with this first commandment. There's lots of evidence for so many. Well, next slide, please. Many of you will know that there has been a wealth of literature out there for the merits of social media. So from opinion pieces all the way up to systematic reviews, they all demonstrate that it's a powerful medium for learning. But how does it work? Is that a bark? Is that a bark guy here? Next slide, please. So let's talk about the theory. There's 2 main theories that I'm going to talk about for social media: connectivism and communities of practice. So connectivism. This is a learning theory which suggests that knowledge is transferred across nodes, okay, from node to node. In this case, a node can be a human or a non-human entity, for example, AI or a platform. It's a very knowledge-centered theory, all right? But it is grounded in constructivism. So that means that basically someone has an experience, then they share it across nodes. So they share their experience from one node to another, and that's transferred across to you. And you read about that experience and you learn from it. Boom, learning happens. So that's one theory. Another learning theory which is relevant is communities of practice. In communities of practice, this is usually applied to workplaces, so like a ward. Let's say you're a medical student going onto your ward. You start off with being what we call a legitimate peripheral participant. And you enter the environment, you start collaborating with the workers, and in this case, the other people in social media. So you start learning from each other, including role models. Role modeling is important in this, and you gradually become more central to that community. This is what we're doing today. Next slide, please. So the question is, does this explain all of it? Well, not quite. So I'm going to throw up a red flag here, and something that's not talked about enough in the literature. So yes, we know what we know because we watch people on Twitter, we analyze data and analytics on Facebook, we talk to people a little bit, not enough, about their experiences in social media. However, I would suggest that there is a 2-tiered system on social media that's developed, at least in the last few years. So we've got public social media and private social media. We could sit and talk about the privacy concerns of social media basically for an entire day, but I'm not going to go down that line. If you want to be interested in that, watch The Great Hack in Netflix. But the fact is, from a research point of view, a MedEd scholarship point of view, we can't really naturally watch learners in their sort of wild, natural environment in private social media. It's really difficult and challenging to do. Trust me, we've tried it. So we don't really know what happens behind closed doors. What little evidence there is suggests that public social media might just be the tip of the iceberg. So students are afraid of going public because they're afraid of exposure, both to their colleagues, so they don't want to look silly in front of their colleagues, and in front of their patients, because they don't want the GMC coming after them. So they worry about these professionalism risks. So quite a lot of people don't actually use Twitter, especially for MedEd. And I wonder if that's actually resonating with anyone watching this talk. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's get back to the story. The next line is, this is where all the students are. So as I set up MediSense, you began to use Vine for teaching. Does anyone remember Vine? Well, it involved the looping of 6-second looping videos over and over and over again. So I used it for MedEd, but mostly it was used for, and you can probably guess this, next slide. Cats. Oh, they're supposed to, these cats are supposed to be moving around. That's really disappointing. Oh well. Obviously, everything in social media will involve cats in some way, shape, or form. Vine was usually used for cats. Next slide, please. And so what I did was I set up a program called hashtag 6-second studying. And this was a medical education series on Vine, which covered basic clinical skills, knowledge. I think what Pedro was referring to earlier, like the little flap thing. But we also used to include things like dermatology quizzes and how to phrase difficult questions in the, like, for example, sexual history and mental health history. So we ended up getting really quite successful with this, and we had millions of views. At the time, Vine was top of the App Store. Next slide, please. But unfortunately, this didn't really last very long. So Vine was shut down in 2017, and we actually lost everything. And you can imagine how distraught I was about that. All that hard work, just gone. The lesson from this is that you don't own your tweets. You don't own what you post on social media necessarily. You know, those Instagram videos that you've been sharing, those TikTok videos you've been sharing, they could be gone in a second. Platforms rise and fall in the blink of an eye. That's why it's so hard to build evidence. There's an evidence practice gap because social media moves so fast and the research community does not. So what happens if our community post-COVID decides to embrace social media and decides, yeah, let's do everything we want to do on Facebook, and then a big international crisis happens and Facebook shuts down? Well, Mark Zuckerberg, he doesn't care about you or your video series. We need to be mindful of trends and fads in social media. We need to go where the evidence is. Next slide, please. Oh, so the next one, it's an opportunity for good quality learning. So here is Oscar with a theory warning with his lockdown hair. My hair looked like this until about 2 days ago. But this means time for some more theory. And this is a good one. Next slide. So Bloom's taxonomy. You might have recognized this from the tweets I've been spamming all over both Twitter and Slack. This is a framework for learning. So when we consider it something good for learning, is it quality for learning, you have to look at learning frameworks, and Bloom's is a really good one because it's both simple and it's reasonably well accepted. Basically, Bloom's taxonomy suggests that there are different levels of learning in terms of their quality or their depth. So at the bottom, you've got remembering, so basically recalling something. On the top, you've got synthesizing content because you have immersed yourself so much in the knowledge and they've learned so much. So remembering a fact is one thing, but being able to master it and be able to critique and create learning, new learning, is a real challenge. Next slide, please. So let's look at social media in the context of this. Well, social media does the bottom rung really well with remembering. So most of Twitter is really just facts blurted out all over the place with some vaguely loose links. But there are some good examples of good practice. Tutorials, as Anna just mentioned, for example, are really good. Here's a great example from Stephen Chen, who's a brilliant dermatologist who engages really well on social media. So he's explaining a simple concept, and reading this, you are remembering. Next slide. So we're kind of okay at level 2, which is understand. You could argue that live tweeting, debates, tweeting conferences, that could be considered level 2. You're developing understanding through basic discussion. Next slide, please. But after this, what have we got? Well, how do you apply in social media? How do you critique and analyze? And how much true, deep, collaborative reflection do we really see on social media in the context of learning in a way that is organized and crucially sustainable? I'd argue, okay, maybe some journal clubs, but there's not that much out there. Next slide. Now, what was really unusual about social media is actually it's great for creating learning. So we almost jump from 1 and 2 to 6 here, because that's what social media is for. It's for creation. And for example, here are some drawings created by my Medics artist, Gabby Petruso, who's fantastic, during a social media teaching session. That's actually a drawing of pyoderma gangrenosum. I just wanted to give a bit of a shout out there. But essentially what I'm trying to get at is that the model doesn't apply really neatly to social media. No model really does, because this is a new phenomenon. We have a lot of work to do on this. This is what my master's dissertation is on at the moment in MedEd. Next slide, please. So let's take the last statement. I can connect to experts all over the world. Well, yes, this is really true. This is what we're doing today. Again, social media does upend hierarchies and connects you to experts all over the place. But, and throughout this presentation, there is a but. My job is to be devil's advocate. In the world of fake news, what actually is an expert? Next slide. So I've got some proper theory to explain this one. So this is going to be some deep stuff. Oscar really loves it. Next slide. So there's this guy, a French guy called Pierre Bourdieu, and he came up with a concept called capital. There's different kinds of capital, for example, economic capital and cultural capital. But what I'm interested in is social capital. Now, capital is really heavy med ed, and if you really want to do some reading on this, absolutely go for it. But really what it was intended to look at was class and how people can rise through social classes. But we can apply it to more modern phenomena, and there is evidence of this in literature. So if we apply this to 2020 social media, basically it means that if you have more popularity based on your connections, your reputation, your influence, and then how you use those connections, you are potentially seen to be more of an influencer, okay? So you have to ask, well, is an expert made up is what makes someone an expert made up of their previous publications or their follower count? This is something as a society that we need to really reflect on, and we need to critique it, and we need to innovate. So in terms of innovation, well, Twitter started giving out some blue ticks to doctors during COVID pandemic, but is this really enough? I'd argue not. Next slide, please. Now, I'm going to repeat the poll. Let's see if I convinced any of you. If you even 1%, it'd be great. Choose your side again. So if you're currently shouting at the screen and saying, well, it's complicated, well, then I've done my job. But I wanted to make this a bit of a binary thing just because, really, for the lols, really. I'll let you make your vote before we move on to the final few slides, and hopefully a little bit of optimism, because there is an optimistic message here. Let's move on to the next slide. I think maybe there might be 1% potentially, or not. If I haven't convinced any of you, then that's fine. But what I want to do is make you think. Right. So let's not end this in a downer. So basically, the message here is I might not have been totally right at the start of my social media journey with my statements, but there is good practice out here. So people do reflect, they do answer questions, they do encourage diversity, as we have done today. We've collaborated on platforms like Slack, and I recommend Reddit as a really good platform for collaboration. We host debates like MedEd Forum at ASME, and we once had a debate about the definition of reflection between finding a medical student and the head of education and standards at the GMC. Where else but social media could you have that? Final slide, sorry, second to last slide, please. So it's time for you to finish this story. I want you to reflect on your experiences. I want you to challenge presumptions. I want you to innovate and build evidence, starting today. Thank you.